Right. Well, yeah, we'll give it like another minute and see, and just wait while people are still joining us. All right, so we'll just go ahead and get started. So I know some of you may know me, but my name is Brianna Schreiner, and I'm the Program and Event Coordinator here at the Colorado Alliance for Environmental Education. I wanted to welcome you all today for our monthly webinar series, where we will be discussing state and federal legislation opportunities to advance EE this year. We're so excited to have Sarah and Katie here today to discuss the topics further. Awesome. So before I pass it on to Sarah and Katie, I wanted to give a brief background to CAEE if you're not familiar with us. CAEE is a statewide network with a mission to advance environmental education in Colorado by fostering collaboration, mobilizing support, and driving excellence. We have about 850 CAEE members across Colorado that approximately reach 800,000 learners. One way we hope to drive excellence in Colorado is through our monthly webinar series, where we pick topics that are relevant and interesting to the EE community in Colorado, with the goals of sharing and sparking new ideas, improving practice, and connecting with one another. I also wanted to mention some upcoming events that we have. This Friday at 12 p.m., we will be having an EE community conversation where we will be discussing the latest CDC changes for mask wearing and what that means for EE programs across the state. On June 14th, we are launching our first EE course, which is the Foundations of Environmental Education Instruction, which is a new professional development opportunity that is completely self-paced. And I know a lot of us are already familiar with Zoom, so I can just speed through this, but please keep your line muted while others are speaking. Use the chat function to send a message to presenters or all participants. Also, if you haven't had a chance yet, please chat in your name, organization, and where you're connecting from. We just love to know where you guys are from. And you guys will also be receiving the recording from today as well. All right. And then before we get started, I just wanted to start with a land acknowledgement and recognition of racial injustice. So one way that we can support equity is by beginning our day by acknowledging our history of colonization and oppression, and that it still continues today. It is important to remember that what we know as Colorado today was a traditional home of the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, the Pueblo tribes, Shoshone, and the Ute Nation. Historically, environmental education has been tailored to white communities, and the contributions of Black, Indigenous, and people of color are often excluded from our narrative. Black, Indigenous, and people of color have vibrant, rich histories and cultures that contribute to our field. We all have the responsibility to continue working to change the systems that continue to allow injustice and inequity to exist. All right, and then I will be introducing Sarah and Katie. So Sarah Bodor is the Director of Policy and Affiliate Relations for the North American Association for Environmental Education. She is NAAE's liaison to 54 states, regional and provincial affiliate organizations who make up a network of support for environmental educators across North America. Sarah works with partners and thought leaders to identify policy priorities and design state and federal strategies to advance environmental literacy. And most everyone here knows Katie Navin. She's the Executive Director here at CAEE. All right, and then with that, we can just get started with the webinar.
And Katie, do you want me to go first or? Okay, awesome. Well, thank you. Just bear with me 1 second while I share my screen. And all right, so can you see that okay? Great, all right. Well, thank you. It's great to be here. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some sort of the big picture of federal policy that's in play right now relative to environmental education, and go through some of the issues and legislative opportunities that are priorities for NAAEE, and that have the potential to be, I think, of great benefit to environmental educators in Colorado. And then I'll turn it back over to Katie to talk a little bit more about some of the state policies and how all of these things connect together. Again, just thanks for having me. I am a huge fan of CAEE and have had the pleasure of working with Katie in different capacities, really for probably 10 plus years. And it's really great to be able to tag team this presentation with Katie. Before I dive into the policies that we're looking at for the 117th Congress, I just always like to say a little tiny bit about why it's so important to get involved in advocacy. This is probably not anything new for you because you chose to be here today, and so I won't spend too much time on it. But I do think it's really helpful sometimes to remember that the reason to get involved in advocacy as an environmental educator goes a little bit beyond just the sort of simple goal of getting a specific policy or initiative across the finish line. There really are a lot of benefits to you as a professional and to the organization that you're representing when you get involved in advocacy. And one of those benefits is that it provides an opportunity to build relationships with decision makers. And these relationships are sometimes opportunities that you don't even see or foresee yet. So this photo, I think, is a great example of, you see that Katie is here with some of her colleagues from other affiliate NAAEE affiliate organizations from across the country, who a couple of years ago were in DC for a meeting and extended their stay in order to be able to make time to visit with senators and representatives on Capitol Hill. And this particular meeting was with, at the time, Representative Deb Haaland of New Mexico. She was actually, I think, coming in as a freshman into Congress. Her office was probably, I can see that the shelves behind her are largely empty. She was probably still very much moving into her office. And of course, now we all know that she has just been confirmed as the Secretary of the Interior for the Biden administration. And so, this is not typical that this type of thing happens all the time where you get to meet directly with the representative. But in this case, it was a really great opportunity to build a bridge around the field of environmental education to somebody who has gone on to be in a position to be able to help all of us. So kudos to these awesome women who met with Representative Haaland at that time. So relationship building is, again, just a really big benefit to getting involved in advocacy. Along with that, it really helps to elevate the profile of environmental education. You know, when you start to come into offices, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level, you pretty quickly can establish a rapport with the staff that helps them to see you as a resource. And suddenly they really recognize what an asset your programs are to their district, to their state. And that can really pay dividends for the profile of your organization. And then lastly, but very, very importantly, I just want to also say that one of the big reasons why I care so much about being engaged in policy is because we all know about great programs. You probably all run really great programs. We all know firsthand how transformative they can be for individuals and communities, but we also are keenly aware of the fact that they're so inequitably accessible. And that they are too often available only to the select few. And when we pass policy, that can be a really important step in the right direction of making sure that life-changing and transformative effective programming is available to everyone. So that's just my spiel, my soapbox on getting involved in advocacy. And now we'll dive into some actual policy priorities. So these are kind of the priorities from our standpoint as the North American Association for Environmental Education that we tend to focus on. we have historically, because all of us are sort of doing advocacy and policy work as just a sliver of our time inside of a bigger job, limited our focus to some key appropriations that come really sort of under attack, unfortunately, every fiscal cycle. And those are the programs at EPA and NOAA that support environmental education largely through grant programs. So some of you may have had environmental education grant programs through the EPA. There are also environmental literacy grants at NOAA and a program that they operate in certain parts of the country called the Bay Watershed Education and Training Program. And we, together with all of our advocates from around the country, get involved in helping to make sure that Congress protects the funding for those programs every year. This year in particular, because of the new administration, we felt like the time was right to ask for really relatively modest, but for the field of environmental education, what would be significant increases in funding for those programs. Because even though we have managed to protect the funding year over year, we still see them being funded at a level that's really too low to have the impact we would like to see them have, and also lower than their authorized level. So when legislation sets a level of funding, often Congress will fund that program, but maybe not at the level at which it was originally authorized. So this year is, you're going to hear me say this several times, but this year is a little weird in that because it's a new administration, the sort of budget cycle is behind where we would normally expect to know exactly the details of what were in the president's budget proposal by now. But because they came in new, the administration put forward like a high level budget, and we're still waiting for all the detail. And actually that detail is expected to be available to the public on Thursday. And so we'll be able to share more information at that time about how aggressively we need to work to restore funding, or hopefully to advocate to Congress to match the administration's request for funding for those programs. So next, and I'm going to talk about this in more detail in just another slide, so I'll only mention it briefly here. There's a Climate Change Education Act that we've been tracking and asking for support from the field in getting co-sponsors for that legislation. We are hopeful that we will see a bill called the No Child Left Inside Act introduced late this spring or early summer, and I'm going to talk about that one in a little bit more detail as we go. There is a group of folks who are considering a proposal to reauthorize the National Environmental Education Act. So that bill is the bill that created the Office of Environmental Education at EPA and that established the grant programs for environmental education that EPA runs. It also established NEF, the National Environmental Education Foundation. So if you're familiar with any of those programs, they all tie back to this bill, which was passed in 1990 and has not been technically reauthorized since. So getting into a little bit of the weeds, but most bills have a sunset clause written into them. And the idea is that Congress is supposed to sort of re-up that bill every 5 years or so and, make updates as necessary. And we've basically been kind of working with a bill that is great. We're glad that it established these programs and continues to receive funding from Congress, but it's pretty dusty. If you look at the language in it, the language is even just old. Like it talks about global warming and instead of climate change and things like that. And so there's a group that's trying to update that bill and potentially get it reintroduced. And alongside of, updating it, they would be including a larger authorization level. So making it a bigger program that would hopefully attract more funding and have then better impact across the country. And then lastly, and I'll talk about each of these things in a little more detail, we're keeping a very close eye on the conversations around infrastructure because there are a number of items that would have a positive impact on school facilities, school grounds, and potential partnerships and programming that might find its way into an infrastructure bill. So I would just want to get into climate change just a little bit. So I'm sure that many of you noticed that as soon as the election outcome was certain, that there was suddenly renewed interest and fervor around programs related to climate change and climate change education. It's been very clear that this administration, through all of its staffing choices, and now as we're starting to see policies come forward, that there is this whole of government approach to addressing climate change, that it's quite serious. There is something called the ACE strategic framework, which is a requirement under the Paris Climate Agreement that the United States and other countries would create a strategic plan for kind of the community engagement piece of addressing climate change. So there's kind of the here's the government approach, and then it's like, what's the rest of our work? And that's what the ACE strategic framework would look at. And so just keeping an eye on that. Related to that is a lot of discussion around something called the Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. These are our commitments to emissions reductions. The initial contributions and commitments were announced on Earth Day during a summit that the Biden administration held, but it's an iterative process. And there are folks who are pushing for this idea that we could significantly impact our ability to reduce emissions if we think about school facilities and operations, the transportation systems that public schools run, the food consumption and waste systems that public schools are associated with. So looking at, all of the impact that schools have, and how could investments in, essentially greening those processes and systems have an impact on our ability as a nation to meet our goals. I mentioned the Climate Change Education Act, and then obviously just a lot of work being done around the intersection of climate justice and environmental education. And I will just mention that we have collaborated with a number of other national organizations to launch a new coalition for climate education policy. And we would welcome anyone who wants to join that effort. I will put a link to our website in the chat in a few moments. And then just to dive down onto the Climate Change Education Act for a moment. The purpose of this bill is really pretty simple. The legislation itself is only a few pages long, which is awesome. So everybody can read it. It's very easy to understand. And it just would establish a new grant program at NOAA for K-12 climate change education. It also has some stuff in there about funding for some higher ed, work at higher education institutes and a youth corps. But the heart of it is a program that would fund state education agencies, local education agencies in partnership with higher education and or nonprofit program providers to do climate change education or to provide teacher professional development in climate change education. This bill has been around actually for decades as kind of just a marker bill. I think in the past it included maybe $20 million a year is a proposed authorization. This version of the bill includes $50 million per year for 5 years as a proposed authorization. So getting a little bit bigger and more audacious in terms of what's being asked for. One thing that's really important to know about this bill is that while it has been introduced into Congress every couple years, and has been used as an opportunity to start a conversation with senators and representatives about the importance of climate change education in our efforts to address climate change. It was always meant as a bill that could get folded easily into something bigger. So I mentioned it's a very simple, short bill. That makes it something that's relatively easy to say, hey, you know what, we're passing this bigger package dealing with climate change. We're just going to stick this education piece in there. And that, for those of you who might not know, that's super classic policy strategy, is to introduce sort of this bill that has a very singular purpose and build support for that concept. And then when there's a bigger opportunity, to just stick that little simple concept into something bigger. And that's important because, as I mentioned, we're watching this infrastructure conversation really closely and looking at all of the different advocacy efforts and outreach efforts to get a better handle on what might be included. So you know that if you've been paying attention to the debate at all, there's been a lot of discussion about how do we define infrastructure and what counts as infrastructure and what kinds of things should be funded outside of the traditional sort of bridges and roads. And so there are a ton of possibilities for what might be included. It's also possible none of it will be included. It's also possible there will be no infrastructure bill at all, but we're hopeful. And we know that there's kind of been a self-imposed deadline of July 4th to come up with an agreement on infrastructure. And so here are some of the things that we are hearing about when folks are thinking about what to include in this bill. So I talked about the Climate Change Education Act and how it's this simple, straightforward thing. Be pretty easy to just sort of slide that into a big infrastructure package. And there are a couple of champions of that legislation. Senator Markey in Massachusetts is one who are actively working on that. Then there's a bigger bill that is not quite as simple and straightforward as the Climate Change Education Act, but the Reopen and Rebuild America's Schools Act is again a piece of legislation that's been around for a while. It would include really historic federal investments in modernizing America's schools across the country. So it would provide funding for those districts that most need it to do much needed repairs and upgrades and new construction for school facilities. And there was a sort of long-standing effort on the part of a number of different organizations to get some language put into this bill to, number one, kind of make the definition of school facilities more flexible such that school grounds and outdoor spaces would be considered as part of the school facility so that funding could be used for improvements to those spaces. There are a number of kind of what I call green schools provisions in the bill so that hold any renovation or new construction efforts to a certain standard of sustainability. And then really a bit of a nod in the language of the bill towards recognizing that sustainable schools provide not just an operational efficiency, but an opportunity for improved teaching and learning. And so this is a bill that was getting a fair amount of traction before COVID. And now, as you can all imagine, it's gotten a lot more attention because of the many issues that COVID laid bare was the fact that our schools are too often in really poor condition. And so there's a good possibility that at some level of funding, the ideas behind this America's Schools Act will be included in an infrastructure package. Also, a number of proposals on the table for, I keep forgetting to update this slide. It should say Civilian Climate Corps. So there are 4 or 5 different proposals that various lawmakers have put forward and the Biden administration for funding a big AmeriCorps-like program that would be solely focused on community-based climate projects. Then I mentioned the National Environmental Education Act, and there's some murmuring about whether or not there would be a way of getting a reauthorized EE Act embedded into a bigger infrastructure package. So that's a big unknown, but it could really be, this could be an important sort of comprehensive package for the field. And again, all kinds of interest groups are looking at this legislation though, and kind of, fighting for their priorities. So we will see what the end result might be. The other thing I do want to mention, even though it's not sort of a pending bill, but they are bills that have been passed, is really just another thing that we are seeing as a real opportunity is the use of some of the COVID relief funding to support environmental education and outdoor learning. again, I think this is stuff that's familiar to everyone most likely, but since last spring, there have been now 3 bills have passed. Each one of them has included a certain level of funding for the ESSER, which is the Elementary and Secondary Schools Emergency Relief Funding. I think that might be what the acronym means. But different levels of funding, and most recently the American Rescue Package. And I just share this chart that shows that the vast majority of, so you can see in one column the total amount of funding that was passed in each of those bills. In the middle there, that's the portion of that funding that's specifically for public schools. And then you can see that of that funding, the vast majority is meant to go to individual LEAs, local education agencies. And then the last column, I just think is good to point out that there is still time for these funds to be spent. And so while a lot of decisions are certainly being made now, there will be time for more decisions to be made. And importantly, there is an amendment to the second 2 stimulus packages that gives school districts an additional year beyond. I don't really understand why they do it this way. They, on the one hand, have this deadline of September 30th, 2023, but because of this amendment, they really have until 2024 to spend that money. So we already know that there are a number of examples across the country where some of this funding has been or is planned to be used for things like outdoor classrooms. And so, at a very high level, we really believe that this is an opportunity to really make some investments that not only help improve the safety and health of the learning environment, but that are also going to help address things like trauma and improve the efficiencies of operations in ways that all contribute to student learning and success. And then, so very specifically, and this is something that Katie and some of her colleagues have been working on, looking at some of these as very specific asks that folks could be making of their school districts, that they invest in things like outdoor classrooms and staffing to support outdoor learning or environmental literacy initiatives, always professional learning for teachers and other educators, field experiences for students, and then again, I've mentioned a couple times these green practices for not just healthy learning environments, but engaging, interactive, experiential learning environments. So just quickly, the No Child Left Inside Act, the reason I put this here is because this is potentially a longer term opportunity to complement some of this, potential use of COVID relief funding to support environmental and outdoor education. Some of you may know that there was a No Child Left Inside Act, introduced for several years, starting about, now it's been like, I always want to say 10 years, but it's getting closer to 15 years now, but it was around for a long time. In the run up to the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And while we were able to get language into the final Elementary and Secondary Education Act that says environmental education is explicitly eligible for federal funding under Title IV programs, we didn't get all that we wanted. And so the legislators who championed No Child Left Inside the first time around are planning to reintroduce a bill that would again revitalize this idea of providing federal support for statewide environmental literacy plans, would offer competitive grants to LEAs and their partners. So there's a real strong emphasis in this iteration of the bill on partnerships with nonprofits, parks, all of your community-based organizations to really support partnerships for environmental education. There is a real emphasis on outdoor learning, not to the exclusion of other kinds of classroom-based programs or offsite programs, but just because it wasn't in there before. And then lastly, there is a new national pilot program for outdoor school for all models. And there's a lot of flexibility around how you define those models with an effort to try to be as equitable as possible and make sure that these competitive sort of pilot grants would be accessible to all kinds of communities and all kinds of schools. And so this is going to take a lot longer, I think, because the idea here, again, is to put this kind of conceptual legislation into the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. We currently call that the Every Student Succeeds Act, and it is up this year for reauthorization, but unclear as the Department of Education and Congress focuses on kind of COVID recovery, whether that's something that they're likely to prioritize in this Congress. But we have to start laying the groundwork now to build support for this. And hopefully it creates a nice scenario where, again, if states and districts are standing up some programs using COVID relief funds to support outdoor learning, environmental education, then hopefully we sort of institutionalize that type of programming by having it embedded into federal education policy. So just to wrap up, I think the high level message here is that we have a couple of opportunities that are, loud and clear. This unprecedented focus on climate change, the historic investments through the COVID relief funding and potentially an infrastructure package, really, unprecedented federal investments. And that, this is my personal opinion that this funding is going to shape education for the next few years. And so now is really the time to be engaging and to make sure that we as a broad community can really take full advantage of this moment. We have some tools for advocacy that I hope you all have a chance to check out. There's an EE Pro group, which is part of NAAEE's web platform specifically on advocacy. It's a good place to sign up if you just want to make sure that you see updates when they come out. We do have monthly advocacy calls, and we try to provide as much sort of resource and background and support whenever we have an action ask as we possibly can. All that being said, your best bet, as you all know, is to really just stay connected to CAEE, because I can definitely say that across our affiliate network, Katie is a standout leader on all things, but in particular, she is always, I think, taking what we're putting out from a national standpoint on advocacy and I think really tailoring it to Colorado, which I always greatly appreciate. So CAEE is truly your best resource for advocacy going forward. And that is really all I have. My email address is here, and I welcome obviously questions here, but also welcome any conversation going forward with anybody who might be interested in talking more. And I will stop sharing and pass the mic back to Katie.
Awesome. And I just would like to echo that thank you to Sarah for all the support that you are providing at the national level, making it very easy for us to send out action alerts and things like that. So we are so appreciative of your work and NAAEE's work. And while I pull up some slides, we're a small group, so if anybody wants to unmute and ask Sarah a question about any of the legislation she talked about, feel free to do that.
I'm so sorry I got on late and I wasn't paying very good attention. Did you talk about SB 200, the greenhouse gas bill for Colorado?
I did not. I was talking about federal legislation, and I know Katie's going to talk about state, but I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Bills that she's going to cover.
Are you talking about SB 200, Katie?
No.
Well, I hope everyone will call Governor Polis every day to support that at reducing greenhouse gases.
All right. Any other questions for Sarah? All right, well, feel free to pop those in the chat if they come up. And Brianna or Lisa, can you tell me, are you seeing the slideshow or are you seeing the preview slides? Yep, the slideshow. Perfect. All right, so I wanted to just fill in some details on some things that are happening on the state level. And you will notice that they're very highly interconnected with what is happening at the federal level. And I would say for everything that Sarah talked about, I mean, you can tell that policy is very connected to funding. And so a lot of the things that she talked about created grant programs. And so there's also for every one of those bills, there's an opportunity for us to think about how we advocate at the state level for how those grant programs get applied here and how that money gets spent. And so I would just say, as you're thinking about any of the things that Sarah mentioned, and if you're like, oh gosh, I have a program that would fit perfect into that, reach out so that we can start talking about that and do the relationship building that Sarah mentioned now, so that if those pass at the federal level, we can be poised to be well prepared to take advantage of some of those grant programs. So be thinking about that. So I like to think about environmental education as charging stations that just power up learning. And so, you know, one of the things that we know is that, as Sarah mentioned, some folks have access to lots of opportunities to power up their learning, and other folks have very few things to plug into. And so you'll notice a lot of the things that are happening at the state level are opportunities to think about how do we provide some equity in some of those opportunities, which is really, really exciting. There are a couple opportunities that have already passed that I think are just good legislation to know about, and things that were not meant to be EE focused, but definitely you could apply EE to them. So I want to talk about a couple of those opportunities. And then there's opportunities to take action and advocate both at a very local level, particularly at the school district level, and then some opportunities for advocacy at the state level that I would love to chat a little bit about. And I apologize, my slides are very wordy, but I'm learning lots, so wanted to make sure we got all the information to you. So this is one of these bills that recently got signed, and it's a 5th day school enrichment program funding. So this doesn't have anything to do with EE, but it's meant to create a grant program to help support strategies that are for that 5th day of learning. And it looks like the text here got switched up a little bit, so I'll talk, but the 5th day program is is available to nonprofits who might be able to provide programming on a 5th day for schools that have gone to a 4-day week, and there are more of those than ever before. So if you are looking, if you work with a school district that has a 4-day week, this is something I would look into, and it's just another opportunity to tap into some funding that has recently been allocated. They're probably still figuring out all the rules of how this program will work. But how cool would it be if on the 5th day of the week, when kids don't have school, they're going to a nature center or going to an open space or spending time outdoors. So this is definitely something to pay attention to if you already have a relationship with one of those school districts. And I can see the titles got switched on me. So I'm going to go back to this one. This bill is the COVID learning loss bill. So ignore the title and just look at the text here. But this bill requires that the Colorado Department of Education must identify strategies for identifying and reversing student learning loss. So they are building a resource bank of whether it's educational products, partners, models of professional development. They're also required to provide information concerning nonprofits or public agencies that school districts may work with, which is really exciting. They just passed this bill, so this is something for us to look into and see how we get on that list of opportunities that will prevent or help identify and reverse learning loss, and be listed as have some environmental education programs in this list that would be really great for those types of opportunities. So that's really exciting, and I think something that we could very much plug into in the field. And again, that's called the Reducing COVID-Related Learning Loss. I've flipped those 2 slides. So those are 2 bills that have already passed that if you fit the description there, might want to look into and see how you can tap into that funding or those resource lists. Another really exciting bill that is in the legislature right now is the Colorado Outdoor Equity Grant Program. And this would create a funding pool to provide grants to entities who are delivering outdoor environmental education and programming for underserved children in Colorado. Those grants can be used for programming, they can be used for staff, equipment, gear rentals, transportation, and other hard to fund resources. It's being set up as an independent board that will manage and award those grants, comprised of folks that have significant experience working in racial and environmental justice. And the funding is coming from the Colorado Lottery. They're reallocating how they allocate spillover dollars. As you probably know, most of the lottery funds go to either GOCO, Great Outdoors Colorado, to be invested in conservation, or the BEST program, which is meant to improve school buildings. Both of those have a cap on how much money from the lottery they can get. And then the spillover dollars that go above that cap have a different plan for being able to allocate that funding. They are looking at, once they get it fully phased in, that fund to be about $3 million a year that would go towards the Colorado Outdoor Equity Grant Program. The first year would come in at about $750,000 and increase over 4 years to getting to that $3 million mark. The good news is that this spending plan has already been approved by the Joint Budget Committee, making it even easier for it to go through the process of bill readings and kind of getting it passed. And it requires no tax or fee raises, so that's always a good thing. It has passed out of the Environment and Energy Committee with bipartisan support on the House side of things. And they're expecting it to go to the Senate this week. We're getting towards the end of the session, so things are moving through pretty quickly, but right now there isn't a significant amount of opposition to it, which is great. So in terms of in the next week, things that you can do is contact your legislators and tell them that you support this bill. And hopefully we can see it through and have that passed. Anything that anyone can do to spread the word, share news on social media. The hashtag that's being used is Outdoor Equity Colorado. So if you search that, you can hopefully easily find some posts to share. You can also look at Next 100 Colorado's posts and share those. They've been really up to date about sharing information about the bill. And the more support we can generate for it, the more likely it is it'll pass a little bit easier through both houses. Leslie Herod is sponsoring it on the state side, or the representative side, and on the Senate side, Senator Leroy Garcia is sponsoring it. So hopefully we'll have good news in a week or two that this has passed. The other really innovative ballot initiative that is out there that we are working on right now is this Colorado Learning Enrichment and Academic Progress Program. And what this would do is provide financial aid to families for them to sign up for out of school time learning opportunities. That could be anything from tutoring to after school programs to summer camps. And so environmental education and outdoor learning opportunities were definitely something that were in the conversation as this ballot initiative was being drafted, and it's intended to support those. The funding will go directly to families for them to be able to choose their own experiences. And they're anticipating that for low income students, which will be the priority, they'll get at least $1,500 annually to apply to whatever out of school time learning opportunities that they select. We're looking at funding of $130 to $150 million for this program, which is huge. That's coming from both a reallocation of state land board revenues and an additional tax on marijuana that's generating that revenue. So again, no general tax hikes unless you are purchasing marijuana. The program design is being developed by the Colorado Learning Authority, and programs that want to participate will have to go through a certification process. So you get kind of put on this is the list of programs that a family could choose from, but it really could support ensuring that more low income students have an opportunity to attend some of these programs, which is amazing. The funding cannot be used to do anything that would happen during a normal school day. So a field trip wouldn't count. It would be things that happen outside of the school day. In terms of supporting this initiative, right now this is expected to be on the ballot this fall. And so we're looking for folks to endorse the ballot initiative and become part of a list of supporters. And so I will, after this webinar, we'll send out the link and these slides for you to take a look at that. And if your organization can sign on to support, we'd love as many organizations as possible to build out that list to show real strong support for this across the state. And then I think when and if the program passes and becomes part of offerings here in Colorado, we'd love for as many of our programs here in Colorado to get certified and be a part of it. So definitely stay tuned for opportunities for that. Finally, the one thing I'd like to just draw attention to is whatever piece of legislation we've talked about today, both at the federal level and at the state level, all have connections to Colorado's environmental education plan. And so if you've been following along, we're actually right in the middle of a revision process for Colorado's environmental education plan. It was first adopted by the state board in 2012. And with the second revision of the standards, we really decided we needed to update it for our context today and do some realignments to those standards. So we just closed the public comment period, but there are a ton of opportunities for any of these policies to support what's in that plan and opportunities for us to make connections. So if you haven't looked at the plan, there are 4 goals. One is all around strengthening collaboration and getting as many different types of stakeholders involved in making sure that pre-K through 12 students have access to environmental education as possible. We want to provide professional development to educators, both formal and non-formal. And there are a variety of sub-goals underneath each of these things. We want to improve access to environmental education experiences and create pathways to explore environmental career opportunities, as well as how does bringing an environmental lens to any career support learners. If you go to our website and download a copy of the draft plan, there are actually recommended actions for whatever type of stakeholder you are, for you to tune in or for you to talk to folks you work with about ways that they can help support these goals. And so we hope that this will be really widely implemented, and there will be a lot of folks who are helping to support the implementation of the plan. And as Sarah mentioned, there's a lot of funding going to schools right now. I'll just kind of reiterate what she already mentioned, but the dollar number for Colorado is $1.8 billion that is coming out of the 3 funds and coming to Colorado. And that can both help support what's in the plan and helping meet those goals, but it can also help support your individual programming. And so I think, as Sarah mentioned, kind of thinking about this in long term and thinking about how to use some of these short-term opportunities to build up to some of these long-term opportunities is really, really important. And Sarah already talked about this, so I will skip it. But the last tie back I'll make is Sarah talked about the No Child Left Inside Act that hopefully will be reintroduced and provides funding to states that have an environmental education plan. There are 5 components that are required as part of that plan. And I will say our plan right now does a good job on some of these, but there are some areas where we have some leverage. And so if there is legislation moving to send federal funding to states that have a plan with all of these requirements, we really have an opportunity to advocate to make that plan even stronger than the new draft is. And one of those opportunities would be really looking at high school graduation requirements. And that is one of the requirements of a plan to receive that federal funding. And Colorado currently has very loose graduation requirements. And so potentially with that federal legislation moving, we'll have an opportunity to start advocating to strengthen some of these pieces of the plan that maybe don't have very much teeth right now, but could have much stronger teeth in the state. So I think working at the federal level will help us work at the state level. The other piece where I see a huge opportunity for leverage is in measuring of environmental literacy and thinking about how to do that. Currently, the plan has some language in there about measuring environmental literacy of students, but it's pretty loose, very optional, and could definitely be strengthened. So I think that's another opportunity that we see coming up to think about how to leverage some of these things that are moving at the federal level on the state level. So a couple things that I will just leave you with in terms of next steps. Start thinking about the case for your program. There's a lot of potential funding sources coming through. And so if we're ready and can describe how our programs help do things like prevent learning loss, recover from COVID, when that funding comes through, we can be ready to make a strong case for whether it's the funding at the district level or at the state level to support these programs. So do that local outreach to your school district now. Start reaching out and figuring out who are the people who are making these decisions. Google your school board latest minutes, because they're probably talking about some of these funding opportunities to come down. Figure out who the contact people are who are making these decisions, that you can at least put some of the things that you're doing on their radar, because they are all helping support what schools are looking to do with this funding. And then particularly for the Outdoor Equity Fund, if you have a chance to email your legislator, we'd love to see that pass, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. It'd be a huge win for Colorado. And then of course, you can always reach out to me directly if you have thoughts or want to chat through any of the opportunities that exist. And I know we only have 2 minutes, but feel free to throw out any questions to either me or to Sarah.
Hey, Brian. Hey, with regard to that fifth day school enrichment program, is that also applicable to school programs that have gone completely virtual? I know, there's a lot of movement into the next school year where kids are just going to, opt in to just go fully virtual, regardless of, COVID health protocols or not. Families have just found that this virtual model works for them. How will kind of the virtual kind of cohorts be kind of included in those opportunities?
That is a great question. I can definitely do some more research on that. My guess is for this fifth day grant program, they're not looking at that.
Okay.
But I can do some double checking and see.
And then I had another question with regard to and I don't know much about the history behind the EE plan here in Colorado, but I just got the link and we'll try to bone up on it. How does that kind of tie into other just kind of more traditional education goals and objectives that the state has? How did you kind of ladder that up or down from some of those kind of Department of Education, Colorado Department of Education kind of goals and objectives, and kind of make it relevant in that way?
That's a great question. So I think there's a couple places in the plan where we tried to make connections to other offices within the Department of Education. So particularly the Career and Technical Education office, trying to draw connections and look for synergies that we can tap into there. And then I would say the plan is really centered around standards. And so it's not in the draft right now, but CDE is currently working on pulling out a list of all of the standards that relate to environmental education, and really making the case that this is already embedded in our standards. And these are our goals for our students, is that they master these standards and demonstrating the connections there. I'm sure there are many more connections that we could make and dig into. And I think there's opportunity that we haven't explored yet for really looking at the connection between the early childhood office that is outside of CDE and then higher education, because that's where all the teacher prep is happening. And so there's definitely still work to be done there to align those efforts.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. Just curious.
Katie, I have a question.
Yeah.
For some of the policies, the answer seems obvious, but I'm wondering if there's any preference for these, for environmental education to be taking place during the school day versus after or out of school. It just seems like when we talk about equity, doing it during the school day, make sure that every student gets to partake, whereas after school has more barriers. So I'm wondering if there's any focus or conversation around that.
I would say I have not heard conversations about preference of one or the other, but the intention of the out of school time initiative is to equalize access to out of school time opportunities, and make that a little more accessible. I don't know that it would prioritize one or the other, but it is kind of looking at that education space and looking for equity there. I know I've seen statistics about even pre-K kids from low income families versus middle income families, and the readiness to which they go into kindergarten is dramatically different based on the out of school time learning opportunities that they've had. So there is a movement to look at education in more of an ecosystem, but I haven't heard anything about priority. I don't know if you would have heard anything about that, Sarah.
I haven't. I think the way you reflected it is what I've heard. And I think they probably don't 100% know yet. Like, I think there's a lot of focus on what are we doing this summer? And I think that some of this will evolve.
I would say that I think that in the funding that's going to schools, there's more call outs to out of school time learning than I've seen before. So there's definitely a recognition that, like, with the learning loss that's happened, we might need to look to additional places. And I'm hesitant to frame it as total learning, as learning loss, but I think that's what they're calling it in the bill.
Thanks.
Awesome. Well, I know we're about 5 minutes over time, so want to say thank you to Sarah again for joining us, especially she's on East Coast time, so it's a little bit later for her. We so appreciate your expertise and your support of CAEE on the back end to be able to do this work. And thanks to all of you for joining us in this conversation on an afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.